Hello, general psychology students. So you've now finished your unit 2 and we're starting unit 3. Now remember, unit 3 is the unit for which the exam needs to be proctored. So hopefully during the first 2 weeks of classes, you completed the proctoring form and you got that in. If not, you probably need to try to submit it. And if they say it's too late, then you'll have to ask what you do now. Since you didn't do it in the first 2 weeks of class. But the proctored exams, there are several sites on campus that you can use. If you can't come to campus to take the proctored exam, then you'll need to use Examine or ProctorU or one of the proctored sites. And those cost money, and they take, if you try to do it with less than a 2-week window, it's very expensive. They charge you more. So make sure you organize that through Examine or ProctorU now, because you'll want to get that set up for your Unit 3 exam. Okay, so the purpose of this video, this is going to be the first video of 3 to talk about Chapter 6, Psychology of Learning. And I love this chapter because we're going to talk about the learning principles. It is difficult, I'll tell you that right now up front. It tends to be one of the harder chapters for a lot of students. But once you understand the principles of learning, you really can try to, it helps you to understand other people's behavior and your own behavior. And it helps you to be able to modify your behavior as you want to modify it in case you want to. So let me do a share screen and I'm going to call up the Chapter 6 PowerPoint slides. At this point in the game, you know where these are located in the Blackboard shell. So Chapter 6 is the chapter on learning. Now we have to ask ourselves, what is learning? So if you look at, like, let's say birds, it might look as though birds learn to fly because they're not flying and they're not flying and then all of a sudden they're flying. But the reality is birds don't learn to fly. It's inbred, inborn in them how to fly. And so if you put a bird in isolation, the bird will still learn to fly without ever seeing another bird fly, without ever knowing about it. It's all hardwired into the system. Humans, hardwired into us is speech. So even if, like, we never were exposed to another human being, I think there were like some humans that they found that have been raised by wolves and that kind of thing, they still develop some kind of speech. It's not the speech that we have if you are around other humans, but it's hardwired in us to start to make some sounds out of our mouths. So you're not learning, that's like inborn, inbred, it's just happening. You can think of little ducks following their mother. That's imprinting. The first thing that they see after they're born, they'll start following it around. And you can teach ducks to, well, it's not even teaching them, it's imprinting. You can, if you start walking in front of the ducks instead of the mother, then the ducks will follow you around as though you were their mother. So none of that is learning. That's inborn, inbred, hardwired at a certain stage of development. You just start doing this because of your genetic makeup. Learning is different. Learning is a relatively permanent change of behavior, but it's brought about by experience. So when we're talking about learning, we mean you were exposed to some things or you had some experience that now has changed your behavior. That's learning. And there are 2 types of learning. So one type of learning is associative learning. It's where we learn by making associations between things. So the 2 big kinds of learning we're going to talk about are classical conditioning and operant conditioning. They both have to do with making associations. This video will talk about classical conditioning. The next video I'll talk about operant conditioning. Now the other kind of learning is observational learning. You're not making associations here, you're just watching and seeing what other people are doing. And we'll do a third video on observational learning. To me, observational learning is just so fascinating. We think it's because humans have mirror neurons, so that when we watch someone else do something, our mirror neurons are activated, and it's as though a little piece of us is doing what we've watched someone else do. And so we can learn so well, but from watching people do things, because it's almost like we get a little bit of practice every time we watch them. I think you've heard about athletes who get hurt and they're told to visualize their sport while you're recovering. Even though you can't do the sport, visualize doing it. Well, that's using these neurons to sort of practice on their own. Well, we get some of that when we watch other people do their sport. So observational learning. Okay, so the purpose of this video, though, is going to be to talk about classical conditioning. So there's an association that's made that's then going to bring about a relatively permanent change in behavior. So we're going to say that's learning, that's due to this experience of this association being made. The person who created operant conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. And it's interesting, he never set out to start this huge big field of psychology, classical conditioning. He actually he was a medical doctor, and he was interested in the digestive system. He wanted to understand the enzymes in the digestive system. So he had set it up with dogs. He found a way where he could use a tube to make their saliva bring their saliva into a container so he could measure the saliva. And he wanted to look at how the saliva and the digestive juices all were affected by food. And I'm not sure exactly what he was interested in, but he was trying to understand that system. So he would have dogs, and I'll show you in a minute a picture of it, but he'd have dogs in this contraption where he could give them food, put food on their tongue, and then he could measure the digestive juices, the saliva, and things like that. But in a short period of time, he learned that these dogs would start salivating to a graduate student walking into the room. These graduate students were the ones who regularly fed them. The graduate student would walk in, there's no food at all, and the dog is salivating. Well, this made no sense. The salivation, the digestive juices are supposed to be there to help break down the food. Why are these dogs salivating and having these digestive juices when there's no food? And so he set out to try to explain why were these dogs salivating to the graduate students when the graduate students at that moment were not bringing them food, okay? And so this is sort of what his contraption looked like. He would attach a tube to the dog's salivary gland. And in some of his early experiments, he would ring a bell or do a metronome and then present food, and the dog would salivate. He'd ring a bell, present the food, the dog would salivate. Ring a bell, present the food, the dog would salivate. And after many, 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 many pairings of ringing the bell and the food, the dog would begin to salivate when the bell rang, even if the food wasn't there. And so he called this classical conditioning. So before the conditioning, if you give the dog the food, the dog will salivate. If you ring the bell, the dog doesn't salivate to the bell, it's a bell. So nothing happens. During conditioning, the bell rings, the food is presented, the dog salivates. The bell rings, the food is presented, the dog salivates. The bell rings, the food is presented, the dog salivates. You do this enough times, and when you ring the bell, we call this after conditioning, just ringing the bell leads the dog to salivate. Now we're going to give each of these things different names, okay? So the neutral stimulus is the stimulus, in this case, the ringing of the bell, that before conditioning doesn't normally naturally bring on any kind of a response. Normally, you're not going to salivate to a bell, okay? So the bell is the neutral stimulus. We're going to call it the NS, the neutral stimulus. Now, a dog, you don't have to teach a dog to salivate to food. They do it automatically. Humans too. An infant, you put a little bit of food powder on their tongue, they're going to start to salivate. You don't need to teach this. So this is what we mean by unconditioned. Unconditioned means there was no conditioning, no learning. You're hardwired. This is born, it's inborn into the system. So the unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that brings about a response, and you don't have to teach it to the organism. So if you give the organism, in this case a dog, food on their tongue, the dog will salivate. If you do a loud noise, the organism will get startled. If you blow a puff of air, the organism is going to blink. So these are some things that are very easy to get conditioned. So they happen normally. So your unconditioned stimulus is the puff in the eye. It's the loud noise. It's the food. These are all things that lead to these unconditioned responses, the UCRs. So the UCRs are the natural innate response that's not associated with learning. So you do the loud noise, the person's going to get startled. The infant's going to get startled. So the unconditioned stimulus is the loud noise. The unconditioned response is the startle reflex. Fear, you might say. The unconditioned stimulus is putting food on the dog's tongue. The unconditioned response is the dog's going to salivate. The unconditioned stimulus, you put a puff of air in the rabbit's eye. The unconditioned response is that rabbit's going to blink. Okay, so these are our unconditioned stimulus and our unconditioned response. Now we're going to pair what was a neutral stimulus. We're going to pair that stimulus with the condition and with the unconditioned stimulus. So we're going to pair the bell with the food, or we might pair a bell. It would be silly to use a bell with a loud noise, but maybe we're going to pair a rabbit with a loud noise. Maybe we're going to pair a flower with a puff of air. Okay, so we're going to pair these conditioned stimuli. They used to be neutral stimuli, but now we're going to pair it with an unconditioned stimulus a whole bunch of times till eventually just that bell leads to that response, leads to the conditioned response. So when you are salivating to the bell, that's a conditioned response. When you're salivating to the food, that's an unconditioned response. Okay, so the response is going to be the same response, but it's what you're salivating to, or what you're getting startled to, or what you're blinking your eye to. So I'm going to go to, I want to pull up a different PowerPoint slide. Just give me a moment here. I'm going to stop this share. I'm going to start another share. I like these. I created these PowerPoint slides, and I think they work pretty well at illustrating this point. I think, this is a complicated issue, so I kind of want to go through it very slowly. So in classical conditioning, you've got your unconditioned stimulus, and it's going to lead to your unconditioned response. You don't need to teach the organism this. The organism is born knowing this. And they might be born and not doing it immediately. It might be that at a certain little hormone needs to be released, or a certain maturation level has to happen. But at a certain point in time, the organism, without any learning at all, the unconditioned stimulus will lead to the unconditioned response. Okay, so the UCS leads to the UCR. Then we've got this neutral stimulus. So the bell, a flower, think of anything. It can be I'm looking at myself here, the earring. It can be absolutely anything is a neutral stimulus. Now, if you pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, so we're going to do the bell followed by the food. If you pair it, and then we're going to start to call it, instead of a neutral stimulus, a conditioned stimulus. So you're going to go the conditioned stimulus followed by the unconditioned stimulus to get the unconditioned response. Conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, you get the unconditioned response. Enough pairing of these. So you're going to pair that CS with the UCS over and over, and eventually the CS will lead to the CR. You'll get the salivating when there's no food present at all, when the UCS isn't there at all. So let's give the Pavlov example. So you put food on the dog's tongue, the dog's going to salivate. And you've got this neutral stimulus out here, the bell. So it means nothing. But if we start pairing bell, food, dog salivates. Ring the bell, put food on the dog's mouth, the dog salivates. Bell, food, salivate, bell, food, salivate, bell, food, salivate, bell, food, salivate. And enough of this association between the bell and the food, enough of this pairing of the bell and the food, and eventually the bell alone will lead that animal to salivate. So when the animal is salivating to the bell, we're going to call it a conditioned response. When the animal is salivating to the food, we call it an unconditioned response. You can see the response, the salivating is the same. It's what they're doing it to. And we can go through lots of examples here. So let's go. This is one that, I learned when I was a graduate student, and I think it's a funny one. So if you show a heterosexual man a picture of a nude woman, that's your unconditioned stimulus, he's going to become aroused. That's your unconditioned response. So nude woman, he gets aroused. Nude woman, he gets aroused. So you can have a neutral stimulus out here, like a boot, okay, a woman's boot. Well, if you start pairing the woman's boot with the nude woman, so this is what, when I was in graduate school, they told us that some of the researchers who were studying classical conditioning had taken some of their heterosexual male graduate students and done this with them, showed them a boot and then a picture of a nude woman, they became aroused. A boot, nude woman, become aroused. Boot, nude woman, aroused. Boot, nude woman, aroused. Boot, nude woman, aroused. And eventually, all you had to do was show the boot, and what's going to happen? The men are going to get aroused. So they were telling us when I was in graduate school, they were saying to us, the men who were trained this way or were classically conditioned this way as graduate students were now in their 80s. And so they said, if you ever go down to the local mall and you see some old guy Googling over boots, it could have been a graduate student working in the lab. So it was always a joke that we had. But can you see how the arousal is both the unconditioned response and the conditioned response? To answer what's arousal, you need to say what's causing the arousal. So the arousal to the nude woman, the picture of the nude woman, is the unconditioned response. The arousal to the boot is the conditioned response. And the CS, the conditioned stimulus, is the boot. And the unconditioned stimulus, the UCS, is the picture of the nude woman. Okay. In a little bit, I'm going to give you the example of little Albert. So little Albert was, this was an experiment that was done by Watson, and he was a little boy, and his mom allowed him to participate in this study, where what they did is they showed little Albert, well, what they did is they did with a loud noise. So they're going to bang like super, super loud behind little Albert's ears. And of course, he gets very startled and upset. So our UCS is going to be this big loud noise. The UCR, the unconditioned response, is him getting startled and upset. The neutral stimulus was a little white rabbit, or might have been a white mouse. It's either a white mouse or a white rabbit, but a little white animal. And at the beginning, when you showed little Albert, the little white rat or the little white rabbit, he was totally fine. It was like, oh, like he was fine with it. But what they did is they paired, well, I'm going to pretend it's a little white rat, and then the loud noise, and he gets upset. Little white rat, loud noise, and he gets upset. Little white rat, loud noise, he gets upset. Soon after many pairings of that, so the pairing is between the white rabbit and the loud noise, just seeing the white rabbit would lead little Albert to get really visibly upset and try to get away. And so he was startled and upset and starting to cry. So he learned to fear this little white mouse or little white rat. Okay. So you can see how we could learn fear this way. We could learn to salivate this way. We could learn eye blinking this way. This is all through classical conditioning. Arousal this way. Okay, classical conditioning. Let's go back to the other slide. So let's do an example. So Arania's dog loves to go for walks, and she always puts a leash on him when they go out. The dog used to wag his tail as soon as they got outside, but now he wags his tail when she just picks up the leash. In this case, what is the unconditioned stimulus? So what is the US? So to answer a question like this, you kind of want to set it up the way I just set it up in the last PowerPoint slide. So we want to ask ourselves, what's the US that's causing the UR? And then what was the neutral stimulus that now is a CS that was paired with this US that now leads? So what's the behavior? The wagging of the tail, right? So we know either the UCR or the CR is the wagging of the tail. Now, what would normally, you don't have to learn it, lead the dog to wag his tail? When he got outside, because he's on a walk, right? So going for the walk or walking outside, that's going to be your unconditioned stimulus. And it leads to the unconditioned response of wagging the tail. What got paired? What started happening right before they go outside to go on their walk? The leash. So Lorena would always put the leash on him. So now when she picks up the leash, that's the CS. The leash is a neutral stimulus. Show a dog a leash who's not been trained at all. The dog isn't going to start wagging their tail. But after this dog has had many, many experiences of, she picks up the leash goes on me, I go outside, wag the tail. She picks up the leash on me, we go outside, wag the tail. After many pairings of her picking up the leash and the dog going outside, now she just picks up the leash and the dog starts wagging his tail. So the unconditioned stimulus here is the leash. So the right answer here is B, the leash. Okay. Let's go to the next PowerPoint slide. Gavin recently went deep sea fishing with some friends. Unfortunately, Gavin was extremely seasick the entire time he was on the boat. Now, when he just looks at a boat, he feels queasy. In this situation, the conditioned stimulus is, so this is your CS. So let's put this all together. Okay, what stimulus is going to normally lead to someone getting sick? It's going to, what's the response here? It's him feeling queasy or getting sick. What's going to normally lead to that, where you don't need to train anyone on it? And then what was neutral that got associated with it? And that's how we can pick out what these 4 things are. So when you're on the boat and the boat's going up and down, there must have been something in Gavin's middle ear that makes him seasick. So the boat going up and down is going to make him sick. He didn't need to learn that. That's just the way his biology is. So the moving up and down is your unconditioned stimulus, and it led him to get sick. That's his unconditioned response. What got paired with the boat moving up and down? Him looking at the boat and being on the boat. So a boat by itself isn't going to lead you to get sick, but the boat got paired with it moving up and down and him getting sick. And he was there all day. So the boat's going up and down all day long, boat up and down, getting sick, boat up and down, getting sick, boat up and down, getting sick. Now he just looks at the boat and he starts to feel sick. So our conditioned stimulus is going to be the boat. The unconditioned stimulus is going to be the boat going up and down. The unconditioned response is him getting sick when he's on the boat going up and down. The conditioned response is him getting queasy or sick just from looking at the boat. Okay, so those are the answers here. And this one I'd like you to do on your own. So look at this advertisement. I'm sure you've seen it before. So they're hugging one another. What's the neutral stimulus here? Well, we'll just do it together. So the neutral stimulus here is the Coke, right? Coke in and of itself, if you just showed an organism that had never seen a Coke before, they're not going to have a reaction to it. But what are we born with? What reactions do we have? Well, when we're hugging someone that we love, and we're getting hugged back from that person, feels so good to belong. That's going to lead to the response of us feeling very accepted and loved and pleasant feelings. So being hugged leads to these pleasant feelings. What is the commercial trying to do here? They're trying to pair the Coca-Cola with getting hugged. So when you see this ad, you're seeing the Coke, then the hug, and you have that nice warm feeling. You see the ad again, the Coke, the hug. Notice how the hug is behind the Coke. The Coke, the hug, the nice warm feeling. The Coke, the hug, the nice warm feeling. And eventually you just see the Coke and you should have nice warm feelings. So the neutral stimulus is the Coke, and then that's also the conditioned stimulus. It was neutral before the learning happened. The bottle of Coke was the neutral stimulus, but during the learning, the bottle of Coke was the conditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is the hug. The unconditioned response is the warm feeling, and then to the hug, and then the conditioned response is the warm feeling to the Coca-Cola bottle. Okay, so that is classical conditioning. Now here's John B. Watson's little Albert experiment. where he conditioned a small boy to be afraid of rats. And we talked about that before. It's criticized a whole bunch for being unethical because it's very unethical. And here's the little boy, little Albert. There's a little video that I have under the supplemental informational videos that you can watch if you want to see the footage that we have of little Albert being learned to become afraid of the rats. Now, what's interesting about little Albert's case is that not only did little Albert learn to be afraid of rats from going through this, but later things that even look like rats. So a white fur coat, because it looks like a rat, would lead him to get some distress and fear. A white rabbit, he learned with the white rat, well, a white rabbit, he would learn to be afraid of also. Now, he wouldn't have as extreme a reaction to the white fur coat or to the white rabbit as he would to the white rat. But you can see other white furry things would also lead to fear. And in fact, in the film that I show, the little film clip that's there, Watson puts on a white mask, and little Albert seems to want to crawl away from Watson when he's wearing this white mask. So when this happens, when we get the responses to things that are similar to the conditioned stimulus, we call that generalization. So the learning of the white rat to fear gets generalized to beyond the rat. It gets generalized to white rabbits and white coats, white fur coats and white masks and other white furry objects. It generalizes and you'll get that same response. Okay, so that's all classical conditioning. In the next video, I'll start talking about operant conditioning. Remember, if you have any questions about this, please email me at maryd@cameron.edu. Okay.